Welcome to CSS Positioning, where you're going to experience the absolute best explanation on YouTube. In this video, we'll be covering static positioning, relative positioning, absolute positioning, fixed positioning, and sticky positioning. So before we talk about positioning, I want to quickly talk about normal flow in a bit more detail. Elements occupy their own designated slot on the page, which allows them to be surrounded by other elements. So let's take a look at what I mean by this in diagram form. We have a container. Now we're going to look at block and inline elements, and I want to start thinking of these as being made up of kind of two parts. The first part of the block element is the slot. It's the area designated on the page for the element. We then have the element itself. So these would be block elements, where we have the slot on the page as well as the element itself. And the same thing for inline elements. We have the slot, that is the area on the page allocated for this element, and then the element in this allocated space itself. And these would be our inline elements. Now I know this idea of slots on the page for each element may be new to you, as you've likely just thought of an element just being there. But for us to think of positioning, we now need to think of elements as being made up of two components. A slot, which is the area designated for the element, and then the element itself. So let's now talk about the position property. The position property determines how an element is positioned on the page. In CSS, it looks like this. Position is the property, and relative is an example of one of the values. The values we can have include static, relative, absolute, fixed, and sticky, where static is the default value. So let's first look at static positioning. Static positioning is when the element follows the normal document flow. In CSS, we have position static, where static is the default property. It's the standard behavior of elements and what you would be used to seeing, where elements just follow normal flow. In diagram form, we have three slots designated for our elements, and our elements just occupy these slots. These elements are block elements, so block elements will stack on top of each other like this. So let's check this out in VS Code. So I've gone ahead and created an index.html file and linked a style sheet which is currently empty. Inside the body, I want to go grab a div to act as a container. I'm going to give it the class container. And then in here, I'm going to add three divs. I'm going to number them 1, 2, and 3. And I'm going to add a class to each div. Box 1, box 2, and box 3. So we have a main container holding three divs. Let's head to app.css. The first thing I want to do is grab the universal selector and reset all margin and padding. I'm then going to grab the container. I'm going to give it a width of 800 pixels and a height of 800 pixels. Just so we can see it, I'm going to give it a background color of light gray. I'm also going to give the entire container a margin top of 100 pixels just to move it down slightly. And I'm going to give it a margin left of 100 pixels to move it right slightly. I'm also going to give it a font size of 40 pixels, which will be inherited by our different boxes. Let's go style the boxes now. I'll select box 1. I'm going to give it a height of 100 pixels, a width of 100 pixels, and just so we can see it, I'm going to give it a background color of light coral. I'm going to copy this rule, change it to box 2, change the height to 200 pixels, the width to 200 pixels, and change the color to light green. I'll copy this again, and for box 3, I'm going to give it a height of 300 pixels, a width of 300 pixels, and change the color to light sky blue. All right, let's check this out in the browser. Okay, nothing crazy going on. We have our main container in gray and our different boxes stacked on top of each other because they're block elements. Now let's go to block 2, add the position property, and give it the value static. If I refresh, nothing changes. Static is just the default value of all elements. And once again, what this means is that the element fills the slot it is allocated. Now I know this idea of slot may seem very new and not relevant at all, but let's now go and see this idea of slot and element by looking at relative positioning. In relative positioning, the element follows the normal document flow but can be offset relative to itself. In CSS, we would set position to the value relative. So looking at the green element, the element can move around relative to its original position. So what this means, we can separate out the element from its slot and move the element like this. So the slot remains, that is the area on the web page allocated for the element, but the actual element can move around the page. So let's get a better visual understanding of what's happening here. It's kind of like there's two layers going on here. All the other elements and slots are in one layer, where other elements remain in position as the slot of the relatively positioned element remains present. So in our first layer, because the slot is still there, the orange and purple elements stay in place, now with a gap between them created by the slot of the green element. And for the green element, this is now in its own layer and can move around. So how do we move this element around? We do this with offset properties. Offset properties are used to shift the element from its reference point. Now for this to work, the position property has a value other than static. So using offset properties wouldn't work for regular elements, because by default, regular elements have a position property of static. But the offset property does work when it has a non-static value, like relative and the other values we're going to be seeing soon. So for an element with the position relative, the reference point is the element itself. If you look at the green slot on the left, the reference point will be the top left of the image shown in red. And we can add in axes at this point. This is the reference point of the element. And it's easiest to think of this in the top left of the element. So let's go check out the offset properties. There's 4 of them. The first offset property is top, and in this example, it has a value of 20 pixels. Now for me, I find these values a little bit counterintuitive. So to help, I've come up with this sentence for how to think about them. So for the case of top, what this means is that you shift whatever the value is, in this case 20 pixels, away from the, and then the property top of the reference point. So let's read that out again. If you applied top 20 pixels to the element, what this would do is shift 20 pixels away from the top of the reference point. I just find it a bit confusing if I don't think of it in this sentence, because it's about moving the direction away from your reference point. We have left 10 pixels, and converting this to plain English, it would mean we're shifting 10 pixels away from the left of the reference point. We have bottom 40 pixels, which means we're shifting 40 pixels away from the bottom of the reference point. And we have right 30 pixels, which means we're shifting 30 pixels away from the right of the reference point. So let's go play around with these inside VS Code. All right, so picking up where we left off, I'm going to come to box 2 over here, and I want to change its position value to relative. I'll refresh and you'll see there is no change. But what's happening behind the scenes is that the element is now in its own layer, and the slot remains in place. Now that we've added position relative, we can go use our offset properties to move the element around in its own layer. Let's go add top of 30 pixels. And the way we need to read this again is we shift 30 pixels away from the top of the reference point. I'm going to think of our reference point as the top left here. So we're moving 30 pixels away from the top, which effectively means we're going to be moving down. If I refresh, you'll see our element moves 30 pixels down. Now this is why I find it a bit counterintuitive, because you may just look at this and think top means you move up. But in fact, you're moving the opposite direction. And that's because you're moving away from the reference point, where once again, the reference point is the slot of the element. Let's go add the left offset and set a value of 40 pixels. The way we read this is that we're shifting 40 pixels away from the left of the reference point. That is, we're going to be moving right. So I'll refresh, and you can see now we've moved 30 pixels away from the top of the reference point and 40 pixels away left from the reference point. Now I'm going to change the position property back to static, which is just the default value, and you'll see the offset properties do not work. And that's because the offset properties only work when the position value is anything other but static. Now, I really want to highlight for relative positioning, the slot still remains in place, and the offset properties move the element relative to its original positioning. That is where the slot is. So let's now take a look at absolute positioning. In absolute positioning, the element is removed from the normal document flow. In CSS, we are positioning with the value absolute. Let's take a look at this in diagram form. We're going to be focusing on the green element, and when we set position absolute, the actual slot of this element is entirely removed from our web page. So what this means is that any elements below it can now occupy that space. It's very different to relative positioning, where there, the slot of the element did remain in place. Whereas for absolute positioning, elements below move in as the slot is no longer present. So just like relative positioning, our green element is in its own layer now. Where in our first layer, the green box does not exist for these elements as the slot has been removed. The green box is in its own layer and can move around, using the same offset properties. So let's jump into VS Code and play around with this. I'm just going to remove the offset properties on box 2, and I'll refresh to get the element back in its original position. Now this is still positioned relatively, where we discussed for relative position elements, the slot remains in place. Let's go change this now to absolute. I'll refresh, and you'll see the slot of box 2 has been completely removed. And what that means is that the element below box 3 can now occupy that space, where box 2 is now in its own layer. Alright, I now want to spend a bit more time talking about the reference point for absolute positioned elements. When positioning an absolute positioned element, the reference point is the root HTML element. So on our page, we have our root HTML element, we have our div parent container, we have our 2 boxes in layer 1, and we have our green box in layer 2 absolutely positioned. Now the reference point when using offset properties is the entire root HTML element. The reference point are the edges of the root HTML element. We can't think of it as a single point with an X and Y axis like we did with the offset properties for relatively positioned elements. So for example, if we applied a left offset of 100 pixels, this would move our green element 100 pixels away from the left edge of the HTML root element. So it would end up over here. If we applied top of 50 pixels, this would move our element 50 pixels away from the top edge of the root HTML element, in this case, effectively moving it up. So for absolutely positioned elements, we're looking at the edges of the root HTML element, whereas for relatively positioned elements, this was the top left corner of the element itself. Let's play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so picking up where we left off, let's go add the offset property top and give it a value of 400 pixels. What this is going to do is move our green element 400 pixels away from the top of the HTML element. I'll refresh, and the distance from here to here is 400 pixels. Let's go move it left 300 pixels. This is going to move the green element 300 pixels away from the left edge over here. I'll refresh, and the distance from here to here is 300 pixels. Let's go change top to bottom. This will move our green element 400 pixels away from the bottom edge of the root HTML element. I'll refresh, and the distance from here to here is 400 pixels. Let's go change this to right, and this will move the element 300 pixels from the right edge of the HTML element. I'll refresh, and the distance from here to here is 300 pixels. I also just want to show you can use percentage values here. So for example, if I change this to 50%, what this is saying is move the green element 50% the width of the root HTML element from the right. I'll refresh, and the distance from this edge here to the edge of the root HTML element on the right is 50% the total width of the root HTML element. Alright, I'm just going to change this back to pixels, but I do just want you to be aware you can also use percentages. Now, where absolute positioning gets a bit confusing is that the reference point can actually change. More commonly, the reference point is set by the nearest ancestor with a non-static position. Alright, that's a bit of a mouthful. Let's break this down. What we can do, for example, is on our div parent container, change its position to relative. By having a non-static position property, like relative, on our div container, we'll now make this the reference point. The div is closer in the HTML document structure to the green element compared to the HTML element. So the closest non-static ancestor, in this case the div, will act as the reference point. So if we applied the offset properties now, let's say left 100 pixels, this will move our green element 100 pixels from the left edge of the div, and top 50 pixels will move our element 50 pixels from the top edge of the div. So the reference point has completely changed. Let's go play around with this inside VS Code. Alright, so by default, like we saw earlier, the reference point is the root HTML element. But let's go and add position relative onto our div container. I'll refresh, and you'll see that the element shifted positions. And that's because the reference point is now the div container. Just to walk you through this, I'm going to remove these properties here. I'll refresh, and our absolutely positioned green element moves back into its original position. Let's go add left of 200 pixels. This will now move our green element 200 pixels away from the left edge of our gray container. I'll refresh, and the distance from here to here is 200 pixels. Let's go add a top of 10 pixels. What this will do is move our green element 10 pixels away from the top edge of our gray container. I'll refresh, and the distance from here to here is 10 pixels. We can even change these values to 0. So for example, setting 0 here will have no distance from the left edge, and setting 0 here will have no distance from the top. So it's moved to the top left corner. We can do the same thing by moving it to the bottom right. We can change right to 0 and bottom to 0. And this will move the element to the bottom right of the grey container. So this may seem a bit confusing, but it is fairly common to do this, where all we're doing is setting a position relative on a much closer parent, which kind of acts as an anchor point to reference the element we want to absolutely position. We're not using position relative on our container to move the container around. We're just adding position relative here in order to use the grey container as our reference point for box 2. Just see this declaration as kind of anchoring the container to be our reference point. Alright, let's now talk about fixed and sticky positioning. Fixed and sticky positioning are kind of like special cases of absolute positioning. Just as a recap, for absolute positioning, the element is removed from the normal document flow, where we saw any elements below it could now occupy the space of where the original element was. This was different to relative positioning, where the slot of the element remained in place. So let's first look at fixed positioning. This is absolute positioning, but the element remains fixed relative to the viewport and is unaffected by scrolling. So in a nutshell, it's absolute positioning, but it's fixed to the viewport. Let's jump into VS Code and check this out. So we have our element absolutely positioned, where our reference point is the grey container, because it is the closest ancestor with a non-static position property, which kind of acts like an anchor. Now what I'm going to go do is change the height of the container to a much larger value, like 1500 pixels. I'll refresh, and as you may expect, our element still remains 0 away from the bottom edge of the container and 0 away from the right of the container. Just to better see this on the container, I'm just going to go add some margin bottom of 100 pixels. Now I'm going to go change the position of absolute to fixed. I'll refresh, and you'll see straight away our element is positioned relative to the viewport. That is our browser. So it is absolutely positioned, that it still has been removed from normal flow. The reference point, however, changes to the viewport, that is the browser. And the other major difference is that this element now remains fixed when I scroll. So I'm going to scroll up the page and you can see it remains in the bottom right. So once again, a fixed positioned element is like absolute positioning in that the element is removed from normal flow, and that's why the 3 shifts up to occupy the original space where the 2 was. But the two subtleties of fixed versus absolute is that the reference point is the viewport now, and when I scroll, it still remains fixed in place. So let's now take a look at sticky positioning. In sticky positioning, the element is in normal flow until a certain scroll point when it then becomes fixed. So it's like fixed positioning, but it needs activation by hitting a certain scroll point, and actually remains in normal flow until we hit this point. Let's check this out in VS Code. Okay, so on box 2, I want to come remove the offset properties here and just set a top of 0. I'm going to leave position fixed for now. I'll refresh, and this now moves our element 0 pixels away from the top of the viewport. That is this top edge of the browser here. It's absolutely positioned, so its original slot has been removed, and fixed positioning means that when I scroll, it remains fixed in position relative to the viewport. Let's go now change this to sticky. I'll refresh, and you'll see the element actually goes back into its original position in normal flow. But when I now scroll, such that the element is 0 pixels away from the top of the viewport, that is the top edge of the browser here, it then changes to fixed, where when I scroll, it remains 0 pixels away from the top edge of the browser. So sticky is like fixed, however, it initially remains in normal flow until I hit an activation point by scrolling set by the offset property. So once again, it's in normal flow, I continue to scroll. When I'm 0 pixels away from the top edge of the viewport, it now becomes fixed. And of course you can change this value. Let's make it 100 pixels. I'll refresh. And now when I'm 100 pixels away from the top edge, so about here, you'll see the element now becomes fixed. So let's now take a look at some positioning guidance. Absolute positioning is more commonly used than relative positioning because it removes elements from the document flow. This is preferred because the slot is removed, so there's no unexpected gaps in the layout. Looking at an example, we have this container over here, and we have these visual elements which would have the property position absolute and be positioned relative to the parent container. That is, the blue div. For the next piece of guidance, absolute positioning should be used as a last resort for very specific cases, as it makes responsive design more challenging. So looking at this page over here, the star icon on the right of the image looks absolutely positioned. However, this is actually being achieved by Flexbox. Our image is a flex item, and the star is a flex item, and Flexbox properties would allow us to achieve this result. And using Flexbox is much more responsive friendly. So we rarely try avoid using absolute positioning unless we have to. More commonly used is fixed and sticky positioning. Fixed positioning is used for elements that need to be absolutely positioned, but also need to remain visible when the user scrolls. An example of an element we would want to remain visible when the user scrolls is something like this chat window over here. I'm sure you've had this experience where on a page, as you scroll down, the little chat box icon follows you down the page. Now in reality, you wouldn't actually be making this yourself, but you would be embedding code from a third-party chat provider like Intercom, and the code you embed would automatically have the fixed position property, so it goes to the bottom right and remains fixed. Sticky positioning is ideal for navbars as they stay at the top in normal flow and then become fixed when the user scrolls. Looking at this page over here, our navbar is initially in normal document flow, that is, it occupies its slot, but the navbar then becomes fixed when the user scrolls down. So for a navbar, we do want it to initially remain in normal document flow. We want the navbar in its original slot. But sometimes we want our navbar to remain at the top of the page when we scroll. And this is a perfect use case of sticky positioning. And we even classify our navbar as a sticky navbar. So let's wrap up the theory of this video by building a summary card for positioning. I'm going to be summarizing everything we learned in this simple table, where I have the row headings, the value, a description of what's happening, what happens in document flow, how offset works, and a simple diagram. Let's look at static first. This is just the default positioning, where the element is in normal flow. For offset, it's ignored. You can't apply offset properties to a static positioned element. In diagram form, our block elements will just stack one on top of each other. The elements occupy their slots. For relative positioning, the element is positioned relative to its original position. The element remains in normal flow. That is, the slot of the element is still there. Offset properties can be applied. Looking at this in diagram form, if we set our green element to have a position relative and applied the offset properties left 100 pixels, the element will move 100 pixels away from the left of the reference point. That is 100 pixels to the right. If we then set top as 50 pixels, the element will shift 50 pixels away from the reference point. That is 50 pixels down from the element's top left corner. So our relatively positioned element ends up looking like this, where its original slot remains in normal flow, and it's positioned relative to itself, that is, its original position. For absolute positioning, it's relative to the nearest non-static element, and if there are none, it's the root HTML element. However, we saw it's more common to anchor a parent element with the position relative property, so that we can position our absolutely positioned element in relation to that parent element. When absolutely positioned, the element is removed from normal flow, and offset properties apply. In diagram form, our green element is absolutely positioned, so its slot is removed, and the reference point is the closest non-static parent, where instead of an actual point, we think of the parent's edges. So applying offset of left 100 pixels and top 200 pixels will move our element 100 pixels away from the left edge and 200 pixels away from the top edge. For fixed positioning, it's relative to the viewport. The element is removed from normal flow, just like an absolute positioned element, and offset properties apply. So in diagram form, we have our fixed positioned element, which is just like an absolutely positioned element, in that it's removed from normal flow, but the offset properties are now relative to the viewport, where right 50 pixels and bottom 50 pixels will move our element here. That is, 50 pixels away from the right edge of the viewport and 50 pixels from the bottom of the viewport. The other big difference for a fixed element compared to an absolutely positioned element is that when the user scrolls, the element will remain in place. The diagram on the right represents the user scrolling down the page, where the orange element is no longer in view of the page. Finally, for a sticky positioned element, it starts static but becomes fixed after scrolling to a certain point. In terms of document flow, it starts in normal flow but is removed at a certain scroll point. And for sticky positioning, the offset property is actually required, so the browser knows at which point to make it sticky. In diagram form, our green element is initially statically positioned in normal document flow. Our reference point, just like fixed positioning, is the viewport. We set an offset property like top of 0, and when the user scrolls such that the element is now 0 pixels away from the top of the viewport, it then becomes fixed. So sticky positioning is fixed positioning, but the element initially is statically positioned until we hit a certain scroll point as set by the offset property. Now that you've mastered the theory so far in this video, it's important to understand how we can use it in a real-world web application. For this part of the video, I recommend you download the starter HTML and CSS files in the description below and code along with me. We will be working on the homepage for a major full-stack web application called Quill, which you can learn more about in the description below. This project is part of my CSS full course, where we build the Quill homepage from scratch. You can join me for free in my CSS full course on YouTube by clicking in the video appearing in the top right now. So what we're going to be adding is a little chat icon for a chat window in the bottom right corner here. And I want it to be fixed so that when I scroll, it always remains in the bottom right in order to easily contact support. Now, as I mentioned previously, you wouldn't actually code this up yourself. You would just copy and paste some existing code from a third-party chat provider. But just to put positioning in action, let's go code this up. I'm going to head over to Ion Icons and I'm going to search chat. I like this filled one here, so I'll click it and download it as an SVG. Okay, from my downloads folder, I'm just going to rename it to chat.svg. I'll copy it and paste it into the images folder in our Quill project. Okay, I'm back inside our Quill project. Let's just double check the image is there. In our file directory, I'll go to images and we can see chat.svg. All right, so the first thing I'm going to go do is add the chat SVG to our HTML. I actually want to do this completely outside our different sections, because this layer is kind of going to be floating above our different page sections. I'm going to come right to the bottom here, just before the closing body tag. I'm going to grab the image tag. The source is images/chat SVG. I'm going to give it some alt text of chat icon, and let's give it a class of chat-icon. I also want to wrap this image inside a div container, as I also want to be using Flexbox to nicely position this chat icon inside a background circle. I'm going to give this the class of chat container. All right, let's head over to app.css. I see this chat icon as a bit of a component as it could appear in other pages. So I'm going to scroll down to our components and I'm just going to put it as the last component. I'm going to grab chat container. I'm going to give this a height of 7 rem, a width of 7 rem. Let's give it a background color. We'll grab the primary tint color. That's that lighter version of the primary color. Now, if rem values and CSS variables are new to you, you can check out my videos in the description below. And give it a border radius of 50%, which will make this chat container a circle. Let's check this out so far in the browser. Okay, so you can see our chat container with the blue background, with the chat icon inside of it, is just appearing in the bottom left, below our footer. That's just because in our HTML, it comes after our footer, and it's also not within the main page container, so it appears in the bottom left. All right, so let's first of all go make this chat icon a bit smaller. I'm going to grab the chat icon. I'm going to set its width to 5 rem and its height to 5 rem. I'll refresh, and you can now see the chat icon is smaller than the background blue circle. I'd like to nicely center this chat icon. Because the image is a child of the chat container, we can use Flexbox to easily center it. On the chat container, I'm going to go display flex. Our main axis is running from left to right, so we'll use justify content with the value center to center it horizontally, and align items with the value center to center it vertically. So our chat icon is now nicely centered inside our blue circle container. If you've never covered Flexbox, you can check out my video in the description below. I also just want to change the color of the chat icon to be our primary blue. An easy way to do this is to open up the SVG, and we can just add a fill attribute and set its value to our primary blue. I'm going to scroll up where our primary blue base is this hex code over here. I'll copy it and paste it as our fill. I'll refresh, and you'll see our chat icon is now our primary blue. Heading back down, so let's now go fix the chat icon so that it appears close to the bottom right of the page. I'm going to add position with the property fixed. I'm going to give it a bottom value of 2 rem. This means that the chat container will be 2 rems from the bottom of the viewport, and I'll add right 2 rems, which means that the chat container will also be 2 rems from the right edge of the viewport. I'll refresh. You can see we now have our chat container nicely positioned in the bottom right, and when I scroll, it remains in place. If you enjoyed this style of teaching and are looking at mastering CSS, you can join me in my CSS full course, which is available for free on my channel. It's the world's most detailed CSS full course designed for complete beginners and covers everything you need to know to code CSS at a professional level. In the course, you'll experience the same high-quality teaching and build the Quill homepage from scratch. Join me today and also make sure to subscribe to my channel to stay in the loop with new releases. See you in the CSS full course.